I was deadheading the marigolds along my front porch when my daughter pulled into the driveway. I remember thinking she looked tired. That was my first thought. Not suspicion, not alarm, just a mother noticing the shadows under her child's eyes. She was wearing sunglasses even though it was overcast, and she had that tight little smile she always gets when she's about to ask me for something. "Hey, Mom," she said. She didn't hug me. She kissed the air somewhere near my cheek and looked past me toward the house. I was 63 years old that afternoon. I had lived in that house for 27 years. I had painted every room myself. I had put in the kitchen tile with my own hands, on my knees, over a long weekend the summer after my husband passed. That house was not just a piece of property to me. It was the physical record of my life. I didn't know, standing there with dirt on my garden gloves, that my daughter had already started the process of taking it from me. She came inside and sat at the kitchen table the way she always did, the way she had since she was a teenager, sprawling into the chair like she still owned the place. Her husband was waiting in the car. I could see him through the window, head down, looking at his phone. He hadn't come in. That should have told me something. "I need to talk to you about the house," she said. I poured us both some sweet tea and sat down across from her. She'd done some research, she told me. The neighborhood had appreciated significantly. Did I know what houses on my street were selling for now? She slid a printout across the table. Numbers? I hadn't thought about, hadn't needed to think about. I owned the house outright. The mortgage had been paid off 11 years ago. "Okay," I said slowly. She said that she and her husband had been looking at a business opportunity, a franchise. It was a sure thing, she said, the kind of thing that only comes along once. They just needed startup capital, $250,000, and the timing was critical. I looked at her. "Mom, the equity in this house could change our entire future." I set down my glass. "You're asking me to sell my house. I'm asking you to think about it." I told her I would think about it. I told her I needed time. She nodded and said, of course, and then she went out to the car, and they drove away, and I stood at my kitchen window watching the empty street for a long time before I went back to my marigolds. I did think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I called my older sister in Baltimore and talked it through. I called my financial advisor, a patient man named Gerald, who had been helping me manage my late husband's pension for years. Gerald told me what I already suspected, that my house was my primary asset, that selling it would leave me dependent on my daughter's business succeeding, and that the franchise industry had a failure rate that should give anyone pause. I told my daughter no. She cried on the phone, not loud, messy crying. That controlled kind where the voice gets very small and careful. She said she understood. She said she wasn't upset. She said she and her husband would figure something else out. 2 months passed. Then my daughter called to tell me she'd found a doctor she wanted me to see. A specialist. She'd been worried about the memory lapses I'd mentioned. Had I mentioned memory lapses? I had mentioned once in passing that I'd forgotten to take my blood pressure medication 2 days in a row. She had turned that into a referral. I went to the appointment to make her feel better. The doctor ran some routine cognitive tests. Everything was fine. I was fine. I drove myself home and made myself dinner and watched the news and went to bed. What I did not know was that while I was at that appointment, my son-in-law had driven to the county recorder's office. What I did not know was that there was a document in a manila envelope, a quitclaim deed that bore my signature. I did not sign that document. To this day, I can tell you with certainty I did not sign that document. The first indication that something was wrong came from my neighbor, a woman I'd known for 15 years. She knocked on my door on a Tuesday morning with a strange look on her face. She said she'd been chatting with some people at the coffee shop and someone had mentioned that my house was on the market. I laughed. I actually laughed. "That's not right," I said. "My house is not for sale." She showed me her phone. There it was. My address. My front porch with my marigolds. Listed at $340,000. The photos had been taken, I realized, sometime in the last few weeks. The begonias I'd planted in the side bed were visible, and I hadn't put those in until early spring. My hands went cold. I called my daughter. She didn't answer. I called her husband. He didn't answer. I called my daughter again and left a message that I am not proud of, because I was shaking and my voice was shaking with me, and I said some things at a volume that I don't usually use. She called back 45 minutes later. "Mom," she said, and her voice was very steady, "we needed to move forward. You weren't going to agree, and we needed the money and the house." "You what?" The silence on the line was the loudest thing I have ever heard. "The house is in your name," I said. "My name? What did you, Mom? Please calm down. Do not tell me to calm down. What did you do?" She told me then in a voice that I think she intended to sound reasonable, that her husband had taken care of the paperwork, that there had been a document, she called it a transfer document, and that I had signed it when I was at the specialist's office in the waiting room before my appointment. She said she had brought it by and I had signed it, and that I must not remember because of the stress, because of everything I had on my mind. I have never in my life felt a cold like that. Not from weather, from the inside. I had not signed anything in that waiting room. My daughter had not been at that appointment. I had driven there alone. I had sat in that waiting room alone. I had read a magazine about home gardening. I had not signed anything. "We have a buyer," she said. "The closing is in 3 weeks. You'll need to make arrangements." I hung up the phone. I stood in my kitchen. My kitchen with the tile I had laid myself, with the window I had replaced the summer my granddaughter was born, and I did not cry. I thought I might, but what came instead of tears was something much calmer and much more focused, and I recognized it because I had felt it once before. The day after my husband's funeral, when the insurance company told me they were questioning the claim. It was the feeling of knowing that I had to be smarter than my grief. That falling apart was a luxury I could not afford. I called Gerald first. He gave me the name of a real estate attorney. I called the attorney, a woman named Patricia, brisk and efficient, and she told me to come in the next morning and to bring every document I had related to the property. That night, I went through every file in my filing cabinet. I had the original deed. I had the paid-off mortgage documents. I had 27 years of property tax receipts. I am, as my husband used to say, a keeper of records. I put everything in a folder and I set it by my front door. Then I called my older sister in Baltimore. She drove down the next morning. She didn't ask too many questions on the phone. She just said, "I'll be there by 10, and she was. The attorney reviewed everything. She made calls while my sister and I sat in her office drinking bad coffee. She spoke to someone at the county recorder's office. She spoke to someone else. When she came back to the conference table, her expression had shifted from professionally neutral to something I would describe as carefully controlled anger. The quitclaim deed had been filed 6 weeks ago. The signature on it had been notarized by a notary whose stamp, when the recorder's office pulled the original, did not match the notary's active registration number. The notary on record had not worked in the county for 2 years. What that means, the attorney said carefully, is that this is a fraudulent document. My sister reached over and took my hand. "The sale cannot proceed," the attorney continued, "and we are going to report this. I want to tell you what happened next, not because it was satisfying, or not only because it was satisfying, but because I think it's important for anyone in a situation like mine to understand what recourse actually looks like." The attorney filed an emergency motion to block the sale. The listing was pulled within 4 days. The title company, once notified of the fraud dispute, froze everything. My son-in-law's buyer, a young couple who had no idea any of this was happening, had to be told that the property was in legal dispute and their agent withdrew the offer. Then the investigation began. My son-in-law, I learned through the attorney, had been in significant financial trouble for over a year. The franchise he'd wanted to open, the sure thing, the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, he had already entered into a preliminary agreement on using my daughter's name and what turned out to be a personal loan with an interest rate that made my stomach turn when I saw it. He needed to close that gap, and he had needed to close it fast. And he had looked at my house and he had seen a solution. My daughter. I have turned this over in my mind more times than I can count. My daughter either knew and went along with it, or she allowed herself not to know. I am still not certain which is worse. What I do know is what came out in the months that followed. The notary stamp belonged to a man he had located online, a former notary who had let his commission lapse and who, investigators determined, had provided his stamp in exchange for cash. The signature on the deed was not mine. A forensic document examiner was brought in and gave that opinion in a written report with his credentials listed and his findings stated in plain, certain language. This is not the grantor's signature. My son-in-law was charged with deed fraud, which under my state's statutes is a felony. He was also charged with identity theft and the attempted illegal transfer of real property. The notary was charged separately. My daughter was charged separately. My daughter was not charged. The investigators determined they could not prove she had prior knowledge of the fraudulent document itself, though she had clearly known about and participated in the plan to pressure me into selling. I don't know how I feel about that finding. Some days I think justice was done. Other days I'm not so sure. What I know is that she called me 3 months after everything fell apart. Her husband had been let go from his job once the charges became public. The franchise deal had collapsed. The loan had gone into default. She was, as she put it, starting over. She wanted to know if I could help. I want to be honest with you about that moment, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most. There was a part of me, the mother part, the part that had held her when she cried over a boy in the 9th grade, the part that had sat with her through 31 hours of labor when my granddaughter was born, that wanted to help her. That part of me did not disappear just because she had done what she had done, but I also knew something that I had learned the hard way. Helping her in that moment would not have been love. It would have been me once again standing in the way of the consequences of her choices. And she was not a child anymore. She was a woman in her late 30s who had made a decision, or a series of decisions, and who now had to live inside those decisions. I told her I loved her. I told her I could not give her money. I told her that if she needed to talk, I was still her mother, and that door was not closed. She hung up without saying goodbye. My granddaughter still calls me every Sunday. She's 9 years old and she lives with her mother in an apartment across town, and she tells me about school and her friends and the books she's reading, and I listen to every single word. I am saving that relationship with every call, with every birthday card, with every afternoon I pick her up and bring her to my house and let her dig in my garden and get dirt on her knees. Because that relationship is not my daughter's to take, and neither is my house. I spent a Saturday last fall repainting my front porch. I do it every few years. The humidity down here is hard on paint, and I've learned to stay ahead of it. I was on my knees with a brush when my neighbor walked by and stopped. "Looks good," she said. I sat back on my heels and looked at the color. A warm cream with just a trace of yellow in it, the color I've kept for 20 years because it's the color my husband picked out at the hardware store on a Saturday morning when we were young, and the whole porch seemed like an adventure. Thank you, I said. She asked me how I was doing really, and I told her the truth. I told her I was fine. I told her the house was mine. I told her that some lessons come at a price that is almost too high to pay, but that you do pay it, and you go on, and you plant your marigolds in the spring, and you paint your porch in the fall, and you answer the phone on Sunday mornings because a 9-year-old girl on the other end of the line still needs her grandmother. That's all there is, really. You hold on to what's yours. You hold on to who needs you. And you don't let anyone, not even someone you raised, convince you that those two things are negotiable.